I am really excited to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to start by introducing Geoffrey Okamoto, who's the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. We also have Florian Kemmerich, who's a Managing Partner at Bamboo Capital Partners. And we have LeCompte, the Executive Director of Jubilee USA. And we had hoped that Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, would be able to join us, but unfortunately, she couldn't be with us due to an unforeseen last-minute issue. But we will move ahead with our conversation even without her insightful words. And so I wanted to really turn to you as we will look at this conversation and put things in a little bit of context. So about 5 years ago, there was this big financing for development conversation in Addis. There was a big agenda that came out of that. We have rightfully talked a lot about SDG backsliding, but I want to just take a minute at the top of this conversation to check in. Where do we stand on that agenda? So maybe just with 30 seconds or a minute each, if you could reflect a little bit about where we've come on the financing agenda and where things are today, I think that would be a great way to kick this off. And Eric, maybe we'll start with you.
Panel today. When we take stock of where we are from the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda, I think one of the real challenges is that parts of the current crisis could have been mitigated or significantly alleviated had we implemented what we all had agreed upon, the United Nations, every government, the IMF and World Bank, in terms of raising revenues in the developing world, namely by, curbing the $1 trillion loss that takes place every year to the developing world in illicit financial flows, leaving much of the developing world unable to deal with the current economic crisis because they didn't have the revenue. We agreed to significantly change how we do debt restructuring and work on crisis resolution processes. And while the IMF and other agencies have done good work on improving some debt sustainability issues, the more robust changes that we called for the international financial system and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda haven't come to fruition. And because of that, that's part of the reason why we didn't have the revenues to deal with the current crisis or the tools to deal with the current crisis.
And Geoffrey, I want to turn to you next and just get your sense on this question. Where do you think things have come? Where is the IMF's role in this today and moving forward?
Obviously, we work with many institutions, including our sister organization, the World Bank, whose principal objective is helping mobilize funds and achieve development goals. I think there's been a lot of progress. I think so much of what we're trying to do is stop the backsliding of development progress that has been made in countries, and that includes, as you put it, just the sheer financing flows that have been used for development. I mean, as you were talking here, and it's good to see Eric, and I agree with many of his comments. I mean, so much of this is still based on things that we are trying to work with countries today on, whether it's with capacity development outside of an IMF program or those countries that are in an IMF program. Things like making sure that the economy is ready for and is attractive to investment still, even after after the crisis comes through. That there is a plan for domestic revenue mobilization within the country, that there is a solid debt management plan, good public financial management that includes the ability to borrow responsibly and to invest it at a higher return than you're borrowing it, so that you get positive growth outcomes over time and achieve kind of durable, durable development objectives in the future. So there's obviously the crisis has really taken a whack at countries' ability to attract this kind of development finance. I think several of the organizations, us, the World Bank, other multilateral organizations, many bilateral creditors continue to try and invest more money in countries so that we can kind of stem some of the backsliding. But a lot is going to be needed to mobilize money on the other side of this.
Is in the IMF and how you can be on the front foot. I see that we actually do have Dr. Vera Songwe, who's been able to join us. I'm so glad you were able to make it. I hear you had a delayed flight that kept you. And so the first question we've opened with is just really taking stock of where we are since Addis. And I'll come to you in a minute, Vera, but Florian, I wanted to come to you because I do think we have seen an evolution of the dialogue in sort of the role of private finance in the last 5 years. And so just quickly, what do you think is sort of needed in this moment to actually accelerate sort of bringing in of more private finance, of actually making some changes and not just having sort of a dialogue about how to mobilize more private finance?
Yes, Adva, thank you for inviting me. As we focus really on backing companies servicing the rural poor, so really basic services at a level where the population can pay for it, we have seen quite an evolution. And number one evolution, again, historically, the problem was that the perceived risk is too high. Yeah, in regards to the rewards we can get from a private investment point of view. We have had some problems in the past also that actually aid money was distorting markets. So where we would look at a business model to help scale SMEs, to create infrastructure, that was also a certain component which were difficult. And then we have witnessed the role of technology coming in, really as a key enabler in terms of access and affordability of goods and services. But also recently, in really recent 3-4 years, as the understanding has become that aid money, catalytic capital can actually join and have its role within the blended finance space, a very, very interesting door. Now, we want to stay focused on delivering and investing in SMEs, MSMEs in an early stage, private equity, private debt. We also have seen, of course, now due to the crisis that certain investors are shying away, specifically on the equity side, because of the effects, especially post-COVID. But we also have seen that the solution on blended finance is really to bring all parties in a public-private partnership together. That there's a possibility of seeding funds with catalytic capital, therefore de-risking the risk reward so that we can attract financial investors a risk-reward return which is appropriate. And then, of course, also multilaterals. And again, we're working here with some of the World Bank and also mandates from the United Nations on some agencies here on the together. So the beauty of that one is really that we see an aiming on a common goal or a common change away within blended finance. However, it is a lot to explain and to see how to scale it on the large institutional investor side. So there we have seen clearly a gap we're trying to fill.
To you, and I want us to sort of turn to another issue, and that's what I sort of mentioned at the top, which is this issue of debt. And I think this conversation around debt has been magnified tremendously in the wake of this crisis. And there are a lot of challenges, particularly on the African continent, among low-income countries, but also among middle-income countries. And I think that there are some of the key sticking points now as we see some, this debt framework emerge from the G20s really on what happens with middle income countries, what happens with the private sector. And so I was hoping that you could give us a sense on this issue of debt, what you're hearing today, what countries are sort of needing, what's the response to this common framework, what that needs to look like in implementation to be most useful.
Was that for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, sorry, I didn't hear my name. First of all, thank you. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you may be, and hope you're keeping safe. I think on the recent G20 debt framework, first of all, I think it is welcome. We needed something which will give us a sense, we being Africa, which will give us a sense of where we go in terms of debt restructuring and debt relief. I think that, yes, the G20 had done a good job with the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI. And so the next point was, what happens to those countries that actually do have the need for debt restructuring or some further debt relief? So the G20 Debt Common Framework, I think, is an important first step. I think there still needs to be a little bit more clarifications, at least for us at the Economic Commission for Africa. We're actually planning next week a meeting with African ministers of finance to come together with the G20 and the Paris Club to say, what does this mean? A couple of things around that, I think, are, one of the things that we're looking at is how does the private sector come into this conversation? On the continent, a lot of the debt is private sector debt. So it's very difficult, unlike maybe when we were doing the HIPIC, it's very difficult to talk about a comprehensive debt framework without getting the private sector around the table. But maybe we saw the tensions in the use of the word comparable treatment when we had the DSSI. I think on the debt framework, comparable treatment will become relevant and important, but then we have to define what that means. I think the second thing that is quite important and very welcome, actually, is also the fact that China is coming to the table. China is not a traditional Paris Club member. And so I think the fact that the G20 was able to bring China and others that are not members of the Paris Club around this new debt framework is an important point, because again, as with the private sector, Africa's debt to China is quite high, and so it will be important to also find a system that harmonizes and brings that commission together. There are, however, African countries that are not in, on the track to sort of debt resolution, but that are still looking for additional capital and additional liquidity, and so we are also working, of course, on that track. One of them, and I think we've just heard from the IMF, is seeing whether we can have additional and much more concessional money. Those resources hopefully come through special drawing rights from the IMF. We're asking for 500 billion for all emerging markets and low-income countries combined. We are also hoping that there will be other enhancements that can be done to see whether we can crowd in further the private sector into this conversation. We're talking about things like the liquidity and sustainability facility, which will essentially lower the cost of private sector borrowing using enhancement mechanisms from either the World Bank, the IMF, or others, to see whether we can then have easier access to markets. We've had Morocco, Egypt, and now Ivory Coast go to the markets in the last few months. They are countries that have had good macro fundamentals before the crisis. The question is, can they actually afford to go to the markets in a crisis, the worst in 100 years, and borrow at 6.5 or 5, when we know that actually the developed world is actually accessing markets at 0.48 interest rate. So I think we do need to look at that and see how we can crowd in more of the private sector. We are beginning to see, actually, just this week, 2 or 3 large companies saying they're divesting from fossil fuels. They want to put their more resources into renewable, sustainable development. The continent, to build back and to build forward better, is going to need additional investment. And I think we must begin to look at how we find cheaper financing to crowd them in. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to go to you, Eric, quickly on this issue of debt. We talk a lot about sort of the ongoing conversations and some of the challenges. And so I wanted to get your sense of what's needed next as we're looking into the conversations in the new year, in the coming weeks, and from your perspective, what's needed. And then Geoffrey, I'm gonna come to you and ask about sort of the IMF's role in all of this. So get ready.
Thanks. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Songwe in terms of her assessment. I think that the common framework is real progress, but there are areas where it's not going to be enough. And I think one of the most significant areas we're looking at right now in the question of debt is around so-called middle-income countries. When we're looking at the majority of job losses, at increase in famine rates, the increase in extreme poverty, as well as some of the countries most affected by the coronavirus crisis, we're talking about middle-income developing countries in Africa and Latin America, in Asia. And these countries right now are largely left out yes, there is some new types of financing. There's some promising discussions in the G20 about moving forward new financing concessional for developing middle income countries. But in terms of debt relief, we need to expand processes for those particular countries. We're also dealing with the challenge, again, of the private sector. And this is where the broader discussion that we're hearing several finance ministers raise, as well as central bank governors, around needing real change to the international financial architecture. More than just debt contracts, we really need to look now at a comprehensive debt resolution mechanism that over the next few years can look to prevent future crises. And of course, the biggest challenge that we're dealing with, as this panel is about financing the development agenda, is beyond debt relief. There are many other things we're going to need just to raise the $7 trillion still needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and the more than $3 trillion for developing countries to be able to recover from the crisis. That's going to include curbing tax evasion and illicit financial flows. It's going to include some real changes to the international financial architecture.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask you a little bit more on that later, Eric. Hopefully we'll have some have time. But Geoffrey, I wanted to ask you a question, because I think one of the challenges for countries that are looking at having to do, real debt restructuring is that often that comes at quite a bit of pain. When it comes to sort of IMF restructuring programs and the types of reforms that come along with it. And I think there is a concern going into this period coming out of this crisis that the new frameworks that will be put in place could constrain spending on some critical issues to the achievement of SDGs in individual countries. So how is the IMF sort of looking at its role, how it might do things differently than it has in the past as you look at sort of the specific plans that you're going to put in place for countries that are looking to restructure their debt?
Thanks. I think I think everybody here at the IMF, and I think everybody on this panel agrees that we're in very unique circumstances. So we're not immune from understanding that this is a unique challenge for the world at this moment, and a unique time for policymakers who are facing incredible demands on their time and attention and political capital, including fighting a health crisis, trying to keep their economies afloat. And if they end up needing to engage with us, right, then having to negotiate an IMF program and being able to take the necessary actions that are needed to stabilize their economy. It's in that spirit that I think we really are trying to strike the right balance and meet countries halfway in this, right? I mean, I think no country asked for a global pandemic. We know that. So there's a role for us to be able to provide critical support at this juncture to countries who want to really do the right thing, but may find themselves constrained in different ways than they have been in the past, and we'll work through those challenges. In the debt picture, just specifically, the common framework is brand new. It's untested. And I think, as others alluded to, it's a first step that we could try and build on in the future. But critically, the most important thing for countries to do at the moment is, if they are in debt distress, to approach us and get the advice they need to begin undertaking the debt operation that's going to be needed to help restore sustainability. That a successful debt resolution that is fairly negotiated and amicable between the creditor and the creditors not only provides critical fiscal space that a country is going to need to be able to rebuild, but also make sure that they don't in an untoward manner ward off the interest of investors or other creditors in the future, which they're going to need to attract, as we were discussing in the first round of questions, to be able to make progress on their development.
Well, we certainly face a lot of challenges, I think, on this debt front. And I think, I'll be watching very carefully to see how all this rolls out. And we will have, I think, some early cases to see how this works. Florian, I want to turn to you. You talked about sort of the challenge of scaling some of the financing instruments that we're seeing. We're also in an environment now where traditional aid dollars or donor dollars are particularly scarce. So I know when we've talked in the past about blended finance, you've talked about sort of a minimum threshold that you need to be able to de-risk some of these investments. And I'm curious, is that case getting harder to make, to get some of those now more limited dollars? And as you do look to structure, vehicles that can be invested in by some of these institutional investors, are you getting traction? We've seen some broader shifts in the financing world towards more sustainable investment or ESG investment. Is that having an impact on your ability to raise funds?
Yes, this is a very good question. Also, I would like to refer to what was said by Geoffrey and by Eric, is that the exercise we see is, and we come from a private side, of course, is how to align public money, private money on an investment on the ground. And you have it on the granular side where we see SDGs, of course, there's a high interest and you see more parties coming and committing to do SDG investments. But then that does not necessarily translate into an investment on the ground because of the perceived risk. We see also when we talk about debt, but on a company side, I mean, you have seen during COVID that the rich countries very quickly acted and were bailing out SMEs. This is, of course, very different in the emerging markets and emerging world because it's not possible financially for a country itself. However, what we have seen, and this is an interesting part, is that actually this catalytic capital, which is coming in, it's not all in, it is drawn over time in a vehicle to really attract private investors. We have not only seen developed markets now providing first loss, the catalytic capital, but really also historic forest of Ivory Coast, for example, just saying, okay, I want to seed a fund, I want to set that to attract private investors and industry, and then to invest in the companies and the MSMEs on the ground. So that's one part which is really new for us, and it's an exciting development. And probably that during COVID time has actually increased the spirit of that. Now, the other problem we have, and you have said that it was said before, is that the financial markets are not set to have an innovation on the blended finance side, where the individual components of our structures are all proven, but the assembly of it does not necessarily fit, because it's clearly differentiated between debt and equity, and that sometimes is not necessarily good. Right now, especially, for example, our experience with debt is much easier from a private side to place and to fund companies compared to equity because of the risk. So there's another angle to play. But what we're trying to do right now is that's really talking to all parties and especially to the institutional side, is how to create new frameworks, new possibilities to embrace innovation in the financial markets through those blended finance structures. And that's a heavy lift sometimes.
Yeah. Vera, I want to come back to you. And I'm curious, your thoughts. You did an interview with Devex about 2 months ago in which you said that Africa is bleeding on the economic front. And so, you talked about this effort to push for a liquidity and sustainability facility, about debt. What is the role of the private sector? How do we first, seek to stop that bleeding, but then actually set the continent up for growth? Projections are that most countries are really going to struggle throughout this next year. We know some of the challenges that we've heard about earlier today in terms of, delays in getting vaccines into these environments. So what are the solutions? What are you calling for? What are finance ministers and health ministers grappling with?
No, thank you. I think two things that we have seen is that, first of all, 2020 has been a year of resilience for the continent. What we're worried about is 2021, because a lot essentially in the developed world, to kind of stop the free fall, we got $13 trillion that was injected into those economies. On the African continent, we are calling for $100 billion a year over the next 3 years to see whether we can help to sort of cushion this fall or the bleed, and we're not getting it. And I think the first thing, and it's a little bit what Florian, our economies, the small and medium enterprises that need immediate trade capital, they need some financing capital, they need working capital, and all those, and coupled with that, something that we don't talk about enough is actually the depreciation of our currencies in some of those economies, 25% depreciation of the currency, which is another sort of whammy on those economies, because of course then debt is bigger and you have senior age, but then it's very difficult to borrow new capital. It becomes more expensive. And so I think when you look at that, you really understand the struggle of the small and medium enterprise on the continent and what is then needed. And that's why I go back again to the SDRs. We need some SDRs which will allow us, and that's the connection even with the vaccines. We may have vaccines, but if countries don't have foreign exchange to purchase those vaccines, yes, we're very grateful for the COVAX facility. The World Bank has announced $12 billion, but there is still a big gap. Africa is looking to vaccinate 60% to 100% of its population. To do that, we estimate that the gap between the COVAX facility and even the World Bank resources, if all of it were dedicated to the purchase of vaccines, there would still be a gap of somewhere between $5 to $7 billion that will be needed. Remember that particularly the first 2 or 3 vaccines require an incredible expensive logistics process, because there's this famous minus 70 degrees freezing of the vaccine that we're going to have to deal with.
So,
And then finally,
Vera,
I want to come to what Florian was saying. Go ahead.
Just finish your thought, and then I'm going to turn to Geoffrey on this issue of SDRs.
I was just going to go to Florian and what is happening between crowding in, again, the private sector. I really believe that we must find ways of crowding in the private sector. And, whether it's through some kinds of credit enhancements, whether it's through this is the moment for innovation. If we cannot be innovative now, and if we want to sort of retreat back to, the standard blended finance instruments that we have, we're going to miss the opportunity, I think, to be innovative. We at the ECA are thinking about creating large-scale repo markets on the continent, which would allow us to be able to crowd in maybe, and that's that sort of, gap between equity and debt. With repo, you can actually have a sliding scale from one to the other. And I think those kinds of innovations that we don't have as institutions of the continent, this is the time for us to start thinking of doing things like that.
Great. Well, Vera sort of teed up this question for me, Geoffrey, on SDRs. And SDRs are special drawing rights. We saw a lot of discussion about this at the G20 this year. It seemed like there were some promising signs out of these last meetings. It seems the US has been sort of a roadblock, but that could change with a change in administration. How close are we to a new SDR issuance? And how is the IMF looking to, if we do get a new SDR issuance, if it's a smaller issuance, how are you looking at how to streamline or more easily redirect some of those new SDRs that the world's wealthier countries are going to have, that they can sort of more easily give them to the world's low-income countries so they can afford vaccines, so they can weather this crisis?
I think if you were to rewind the clock even a few years, few people have even heard of the word SDRs or special drawing rights. So just goes to show how hard I think everybody is trying to look at this problem and what to do about it. On the SDR issue itself, special drawing rights. These are we are allowed to allocate these under our articles for the purpose of a reserve shortfall in the world, right? So in other words, a long run shortfall in reserves. So we can begin work on that as soon as there's kind of the broad consensus that's required to be able to move that through our governance process. So that is something that we're prepared to do. It's something that we've done in the past when there's the broad consensus that's required to kind of move ahead. It doesn't stop us in the meantime from trying to do all that we can with the existing stock. So to date, we've already recycled, if you want to put it that way, about $20 billion worth of SDRs from advanced economies to low-income countries. There's that was we put out a call for that 20 billion and actually got oversubscribed on that front. So there's clearly more we can try and do on that front, which we're continuing to work on, as well as just generally trying to look at other ways to improve address the liquidity needs of members. We've designed new instruments as part of the crisis here, and done extraordinary things to amend our policies to allow an extraordinary amount of upfront, quick dispersing support to countries.
Great. Eric, I want to turn to you. You mentioned earlier that if the investment had been done over these 5 years in some of the issues that came up in Addis around domestic resource mobilization, for example, around the international tax regimes, that the world would have been in a better place today. And so my question to you is now we're facing these challenges of debt pressures where budgets are coming down in countries. So how do you look at that domestic resource mobilization agenda in this environment? And is there an opportunity here? Where are some of these broader conversations on illicit financial flows? Can this crisis actually be a moment to push some of these forward? Or are we going to sort of be in the same place 5 years from now?
Well, it's certainly a moment that we need to seize, not only to be able to address the current crisis, but also put in place policies and revenue raising measures so that we can prevent future crises and also be able to meet the financing agenda, the sustainable development goals. And there are a number of ways that that can happen. I mean, part of it is also talking about crisis resolution, that there have been periods after the Asian financial crisis where we talked about a debt crisis management process, again after the 2008 and then in the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And because we didn't have these tools in place, it put countries in a very tight spot. The other side is lack of revenues. When we understand the reality that the developing world is losing or not retaining $1 trillion a year in their economies because we haven't curbed tax evasion, we haven't curbed illicit financial flows. There's a lot of promising work going on with the G20, with the OECD, with the United Nations and the financing for development process, but we're still short of really instituting the policies. And over the last 100 years, after every financial crisis, it's always been a time where we've looked to curb tax evasion, corruption, and certainly look at how we raise additional revenues from those who've done well from the crisis. So these are all issues which need to be dealt with right away by world leaders in terms of some of these tax evasion issues that are taking place. But also it's the time that we put forward policies that are sure to curb illicit financial flows and the trillions of dollars lost every year because of tax evasion, corruption, and a lack of public budget transparency.
Great. So we've got about a minute and a half left here. So I'm going to come rapid fire to each of you. What is the one most important thing that we need in 2021 to ensure progress on the financing for development agenda? Vera? Maybe Geoffrey, we'll go to you. I think we can. Great. Geoffrey?
I think the most critical thing is to control the health crisis. So we need a way to durably get vaccination to as many people as possible globally.
Florian?
Quick and swift finance of SMEs in emerging markets by matching the gap of institutional money and the need on the ground.
And Eric?
Through debt relief aid and financing, we must stop what looks like decades of lost development to the developing world. So over the next year, the most important thing is raising the relief, the aid, and the financing that's needed to stop these countries from sliding into lost decades of development.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for a wonderful discussion. I'm sure we could have kept talking for much longer. These issues are difficult and deep, but also of great interest to our audience here at Devex. So thank you all so much for your time, and I look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you.